Hi, my name is Anna Hendricks, and this is a vlog looking at different women's similarities during the Civil War period. And when I say the Civil War period, I'm talking about pre-Civil War, the Civil War itself, and post-Civil War. Our text mentioned different women during this time period, but specifically for this vlog, we're looking at Charlotte Forten, Harriet Jacobs, Lucretia Mott, and Sarah and Angelina Grimke. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of these women. I want to first give just a summation of who each woman was, and then we're going to look at what these women held in common, what their similarities were, and then within their similarities, what were their differences, and how all of these things come together and help them to unite as women, and how they all used what they had and where they were to bring about change. The first one we're going to look at is Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was born in North Carolina. She was born into slavery. She did not know a life any different. About 15 years old, her master started pursuing her in sexual ways, and this was very, very disturbing for Jacobs. She writes about it in her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave. And this is a primary source where I got this information from. And Jacobs, she talks about the influence of her grandmother, and her grandmother was a free Black woman. However, Jacobs was still enslaved, and it was really her master's obsession over her, I would even say sexual obsession over her, that made him refuse to sell her. She fell in love with a Black man, very young age, he was a free Black man, and he offered to purchase her from her master, and the master refused to sell her. Her grandmother her grandmother had a good standing with Jacob's master and went to him and even pleaded with him on her behalf, and the master still refused. Eventually, Jacobs ended up escaping to the north, and she, even though her master came and pursued her under the Fugitive Slave Act, she could still be, even though she had escaped and was in freedom in the north, that her master could still come and get her and take her back. And although he did try to do that and he pursued her, she was able to escape his advances to where he actually never got her. And eventually, once he died and her ownership was passed on to a family member, that family member then allowed Jacob's freedom to be bought. And so that's how we end up with her narrative of her experiences and her life in slavery. And the second woman is Charlotte Forten. Charlotte Forten was a Black woman also, but Charlotte Forten, she was born in the North, and she never knew slavery. However, although she did not know slavery, she did know and experience a lot of racial discrimination. She was highly intelligent. Her family was rather wealthy, but that still did not help the fact of how she was treated because of the color of her skin. She was denied entrances into museums, to schools. In fact, her father actually sent her to Massachusetts to school because that's a place that would allow her entrance into school. She was denied entrance into even places that served ice cream, and cruel comments were made even when she was in school, and white girls would be friends with her in school, but then see her out on the street and would not even acknowledge her presence. From all of these experiences, it really shaped Forten, and to where she started to use her voice to fight against prejudice and oppression. She was a highly motivated young woman, and she even felt that if she could prove herself intellectually, then she could prove that black people were not inferior to white people, that they were capable of learning and growing and succeeding just as much as white people were. So her successes, she didn't even consider her own success. She actually considered it a success for her race. She was really hard on herself. She also, her failures, she felt like she was letting her race down. She felt a heavy burden to really prove equality, the equality of her race with the white race. This information comes from a primary source, which is her journal, the Journal of Charlotte L. Fortin. And so we're going to look at her also. The other two women, we're going to kind of look at these two women together. They're often known in historical writings as the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. These are two women who were born in South Carolina. They were white women, and they were actually slave owners. And these two women, as they grew, they realized that slavery was not right. But what they did, they didn't just stop at oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, but there's not anything we can do about it, or this is wrong, but this is way beyond us. They did not stop there. They actually used their voice and became abolitionists. They used their voices, especially Angelina. She actually stayed in the South for a while Sarah moved to the North to join the abolitionist movement. Sarah decided, I need to affect change here in the South, and they wrote letters and pamphlets and articles encouraging white slave owners, specifically white women, to free their slaves. The Grimke sisters were also very passionate about the equality of all people. They did not consider one race inferior or superior to another, but they were very passionate about advocating for equality for all. The final lady we will look at will be Lucretia Mott. She was a white woman in the North, a very staunch abolitionist. She was actually a Quaker minister. And so she belonged to that faith, the Quaker faith. She was a force to be reckoned with. She was one who, when she wasn't even allowed to speak at certain places because she was a woman, she really didn't care. She stood up and spoke anyway. She wasn't one to back down. She was not a coward at all. Her home was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. She fought strongly for slavery, and she also fought for women. She fought for women's rights. She was actually one of the founders of the Seneca Falls Convention, which is where the women's rights movement started. She fought for poor women. She organized many organizations. And this information comes from an article. It was a secondary source, a newspaper article that was written around the anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. And I do want to back up for a minute. The article, the information from the Grimke sisters, it actually comes from a JSTOR article, which would be a scholarly source. So all of these women, clearly they were all vastly different. Different races, different experiences, different upbringings, different paradigms. But although they were all very different, they also have many similarities. And that's what I want us to kind of shift gears for a minute and look at the similarities these women held. They all used their voices for change. They all made choices. They had choices before them, and they made these choices and had consequences for those choices. They also had fights that they fought. And all of these women held on to hope despite the hardships and the trials they faced. They all held on to hope using their voices. Jacobs, she used her voice to tell her personal story of slavery. In her story, she's very tempted to leave out parts of it that she says she's very ashamed of, she's not proud of, but she wanted the truth to be told. She wanted her reader to be able to see what slavery was like for a young girl. And so she doesn't back away from any of it, but she tells about how at the age of 15, how her master just sexually pursued her. And although this was not her fault and this was not of her doing, she still felt the shame of that. She hated him. She hated every minute of what he would do to her. She was also hated by her mistress, and so she didn't even have a safe place there. She again, I mentioned her grandmother earlier. She did have a grandmother that there was a safe haven there for Jacobs, but Jacobs, once she is free and in the north, she does write her story down, which has actually become a classic and very important in helping us to understand what slavery looked like from a slave's perspective. Again, I mentioned earlier that her master would not free her. Jacobs even says in her book that she ashamedly so, she felt like if she became pregnant with another man's baby that her master would release her. And so she did have an affair with a white man that was a very prominent white man, and her two children actually came from that man, and the man was willing to buy Jacobs, but again, her cruel master would not allow that to happen. He always had the same thing he would say over and over. When someone would offer to buy her, he would say, well, this is my daughter's property, and it's up to my daughter to sell her. I cannot do that. Whereas he really just wanted Jacobs for his own sick pleasure. And again, because of her master's affections for her, this caused her mistress to despise her, and so she also lived under that cruel hand as well. But again, Jacobs had a voice, and she didn't shy away from using it. She even used her voice to tell the hard parts of her story. Charlotte Forten, she used her voice and her pen to speak up against racial prejudice. During her early years as a young woman, she faced much discrimination and much prejudice. I've already mentioned those earlier, but she would use her pen to journal about these incidences. She would use her pen to journal about how she felt and the resentment and the bitterness and the unfairness of all of it. And she would write articles after there was this experiment called the Port Royal experiment after Sherman's army came in and overtook Port Royal, South Carolina. There was an experiment with the former slaves there. They brought in teachers to educate these former slaves, and although Forten did not like teaching, she actually went and taught these slaves. And after her experience and how she saw what she had thought all along, that Black people could learn just as much as white people, and Black people could succeed and move forward just as much as white people, she wrote of these experiences in different magazine articles. So Forten really used her voice through her pen. And she showed that her people were not an inferior race, but as capable as anyone of, because it's the human race that we all belong to. One is not inferior or superior to another one. So that is how Forten used her voice. The Grimke sisters, they used their voices to speak out against the horrors of slavery. These women were actually the only white Southern women abolitionists. They had a firsthand experience of what slavery looked like, except on the other side, at the hands of the white oppressor, at the hands of the white owner. And so they used their voice to speak out against slavery. But not only slavery, they held the same views as Forten, that one race is not inferior or superior to another one. And they were very vocal on this. Both of these women were both very vocal on the equality of all. Mott, she used her voice to boycott items attained through slavery. She was very vocal in this area, even in places, I mentioned this earlier, where places where women were denied to speak. Mott used her voice to speak anyway. She did not care. She was often people would often not pay her any attention, and they would even accuse her of being promiscuous because she spoke to audiences of both men and women. But Mott did not back down. She continued to use her voice anyway. So voice, that was one similarity that all of these women had in common. They used their voices to make a change for good, for the better. Choices, another similarity each of these women had. These women had different choices, and with choices come consequences, good and bad. For example, Jacob's, she desperately wanted her children to be free. When her master, that cruel master, he actually offered her a small cottage away from the plantation that he would build her, and he promised that she and her children would be free, and really he just wanted her away from everyone so that he can have her at his own use and wouldn't have to sneak around to do it. But Jacob's she was smart, she was wise, she was on to him, and she refused this. And so with this choice, refusing this cottage, she and her children would have to be at the plantation, and her children would actually be slaves. So with a choice to not be her master's all the time sex slave, so to speak, with that choice, she also made another choice that not only would she continue in slavery, but her children would be slaves as well. Another choice Jacob made was that even though she didn't know what it may cost her, what risk she was taking, she actually approached the father of her children, that esteemed white man. He was actually running for a political office, and she approached him and said, when you get into this office, would you emancipate my children? She went for him and advocated for them. And she had no idea what that may cost her, but she did it anyway. Another choice Jacob made, she was just exasperated at the treatment that she endured through her master, and so she escaped his house. And although he thought at that time she had fled to the north, she actually was kind of right under his nose. She was in this small crevice in her grandmother's attic, and she chose to live there for 7 years. She would keep a watchful eye on her children. She loved her children so much, and she desperately, desperately wanted them to be free. And so all of these choices she was making for the sake of her children. Fortin also made choices. Fortin grew up in a very strong abolitionist family. Her family, again, they were considered wealthy, and talk of slavery and freedom and equality were all conversations that Fortin grew up hearing. Although she was in a wealthy family, she could have chosen to live a life of ease and comfort, but instead Fortin chose to live a life fighting for the same things that her family had fought for, specifically speaking out against prejudice and oppression. Another choice she made was, although she didn't like teaching, she still chose to go to Port Royal, South Carolina, and teach former slaves how to read and how to write. Through this choice, she was able to prove what she had thought all along, that they are not an inferior race. And then she was able to write about the results so that other people could see the same thing that she had been thinking even as a young girl, that her race was equal with the white race, that we're all equal. We're all able to learn, given the right opportunities. The Grimke sisters, they chose to first of all, they chose to leave the life of being a slave owner. They chose to speak out against slavery. They chose to speak out in places, especially churches. They were very involved in different churches, and they chose to use their voice to speak up against injustices that they saw, particularly, again, the racial inferiority of blacks the way that they saw black people. The church saw black people, not the Grimke sisters. And they chose to speak out against slavery. And because of this choice, actually, out of several churches, they were asked to leave. Even in the Quakers, they were asked to leave. Because they believed in the equality for all. The Grimke sisters also, they had 2 nephews. So their brother had fathered 2 children by a slave. And when the Grimke sisters found this out, they welcomed these 2 nephews into their home. They welcomed them openly. They welcomed them financially. They did not back down from it. These young men were just as much a part of their family as a white person would be. And so not only did they use their voices, their actions, backed up what they were saying. Mott, with choosing to speak in mixed company, she chose not to be quiet. She chose to speak even when it was not acceptable for her to speak. Even one particular story that was told about her, she was speaking to a group of mixed genders, and as she was speaking, a mob came and set the place on fire. She was not afraid. She was not going to be quiet, and to speak up for things that were right and things that were true. And actually, this mob tried to go set her house on fire, and it was intervened, and that actually didn't happen. But Mott did not let it stop her, so she chose to still keep fighting for what was right. Another similarity all of these women held, the similarity they had, they all used their voices, and they all made choices. They didn't just stand by and let things happen, but they all actively made choices. But another thing these women share in common is a fight. They all had something to fight for. Although Jacob's fight was ultimately against slavery, and once she escaped to the north, she did join the abolitionist movement, but the heart and drive of her fight was freedom for her children. She was enveloped in a mother's love, and she did not want her children to suffer as she had, and she wanted liberty for her children. She desired that was the fight for her. She desired liberty for her children more than she desired life for herself. She knew suffering was temporary, and I wanted to give a quote here from Jacobs. And in this quote, she's actually referring to when she chose to not go to the cottage that the master offered, but to stay on the plantation, which again meant her children would be in slavery. This is what she says here, I quote, "I had my secret hopes, but I must fight my battle alone. I had a woman's pride and a mother's love for my children, and I resolved that out of the darkness of this hour, a brighter dawn should rise for them. My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each." Fortin suffered most at the hands of racial discrimination and oppression. This is where she chose to fight her fight. She recorded her feelings and hardships and thoughts as she underwent each harsh word, each refusal, each time she was ignored in society. She always pushed herself to do better, to work harder. She saw her battle as one as if she could prove saw her battle as one that she could prove that the black person was just as capable as the white person. That is where her fight was. The Grimke sisters, clearly their fight was against slavery and for equality of all people. Their fight and testimony was so valuable because they left that life of slave owning. They had experienced what slaves had endured at the hands of the whites. When they actually called out the Quakers on their prejudice, in the Quaker church, there was a place where black people would sit and where white people would sit. And the Quakers actually called out the prejudice of that within the Quaker church. And they went and sat where the black people sat. They sat with them. They were friends with black people. They were friends with all. And the Quakers actually accused them by doing that act of sitting on the same seat. They accused them of being unwomanly. But the Grimke sisters did not back down. They did not stop from their fight. and they refused to stand by and let injustices happen. Mott, she fought against slavery with her voice. She used her home to help slaves as they escaped to the North, to hide them and to help them, to give them a place of refuge. She fought for women's rights. She fought for a woman's right to a university education. She fought for a woman's right to vote, and she did this without violence. Someone once said about Mott, and I quote here, that she was the most belligerent non-resistant he ever saw. Hope. All of these women had hope, and they did not let go of their hope. Jacob's, throughout her whole life, she always had the hope of freedom. With each hope of freedom that endured and each blow that followed, Jacob still held on to her hope. Living in the tiny, cramped space for 7 years, she was in different positions for long periods of time that ended up causing her physical maladies. Yet she still held on to hope, despite the fear that she may be caught or captured or even killed for escaping to the North. She still held on to hope. Despite the fact that her master could come to the North and stake his claim to her as his property, she still held on to hope. She never let go of hope. Fortin, she felt if her people could faithfully just press on, continue to chip away at the walls of oppression and prejudice and never give up, then one day, if not for her generation, then for another generation, men and women would see one another as equals in their eyes. Fortin notes, and I quote here, "How long, oh how long must we continue to suffer, to endure? Conscience answers it is wrong. It is ignoble to despair. Let us labor earnestly and faithfully to acquire knowledge, to break down the barriers of prejudice and oppression. Let us take courage, never ceasing to work, hoping and believing that if not for us, for another generation, there is a brighter day in store, when slavery and prejudice shall vanish before the glorious light of liberty and truth, when the rights of every colored man shall everywhere be acknowledged and respected, and he shall be treated as a man and a brother." This was the hope that Fortin held on to. The Grimke sisters, they had hope that one day all would be equal in homes, in churches, in schools, in society. Mott, she held on to the hope that truth would reign. Mott was, she was one who felt that if truth is truth, then why should anyone back down and be a coward? So her hope was that truth would reign, and truth is that all men are created equal. All men and women are created equal. And so her hope was that truth would reign, that slavery would be abolished, and that women would have rights. So here we have 5 different women, 5 different stories, 5 different paradigms, 5 different experiences, yet all bound together by the common thread of their voices used, their choices made, their fights fought, and their hope held. And that is what even today continues in a world full of differences, in a world that's still fighting for freedoms and for justice. That is what holds us all together. Our voices, our choices, our